In the third week of March 2026, Sri Lanka's parliament was the stage for significant debate. We're going to break down how the opposition used this critical week to challenge the government on some of the most urgent issues facing the nation.
You know, the entire week was really defined by this intense back and forth over major national crises. But it all kicked off with a pretty controversial move to suspend a session, a decision the opposition felt was a direct attempt to silence them before they could even get started.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll start with that controversial decision that set the tone for the week. Then, we'll get into the tough questions the opposition fired at the government. After that, we'll dive deep into the big debates, see what was happening behind the scenes in the committees, and wrap it all up with the main takeaways from this whole showdown.
So, the week in Parliament didn't exactly begin with a calm debate. Nope, it started with a dispute, and that really set a contentious tone for everything that came after. The whole thing was about a government proposal to just cancel a full day of sitting.
Here's the breakdown. The government wanted to suspend the session for Wednesday, March 18th. The opposition? Well, they weren't having it. They argued there was absolutely no good reason, especially since all the MPs were already in Colombo ready to work. They really framed it as a deliberate tactic to avoid talking about the country's growing problems.
Once they actually secured the session, the opposition wasted no time. They used their platform to officially question the government on several really pressing matters. And this wasn't just about getting answers on the spot, it was about getting the government's plans, or lack thereof, down on the official record.
First up, the leader of the opposition went straight for a huge potential issue, a fuel crisis that seemed to be brewing because of conflict in the Middle East. He demanded to know what the government's plan was for managing fuel, electricity, and essential transport if things got bad.
Then, the conversation shifted from global energy to the digital world. MP 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗏𝗦𝗖𝗥𝗓𝗙 onto the spotlight onto cryptocurrency. He asked about its legal status, how it was being taxed, and what the government was doing to protect people from fraud and money laundering tied to it. On Thursday, the focus sharpened to the very human cost of the economy. The leader of the opposition was back at it, this time pressing the government on poverty and the massive gap between the rich and poor. He asked for a straight answer on how they even defined poverty and what specific policies they had to tackle it. The questions also delved into the really painful legacy of the war. MP 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗦𝗧𝗦𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 people who disappeared. He wanted to know if the government would finally set up an international body to look into it.
And you know what's really telling here is just how much information was being requested. MP 𝗦𝗦𝗕𝗏𝗦𝗖𝗥𝗜𝗕𝗘 also asked for a mountain of data on the country's aviation services. We're talking 3 years of passenger numbers for 5 different airports, plus tax revenue and flight data. It's a classic parliamentary move, really, trying to get a clear picture of how a vital part of the economy is actually doing.
All those formal questions really just set the stage for the main event, these huge, sprawling debates that took over the week. The opposition's strategy became pretty clear. They were connecting the dots between the energy crisis, the struggling economy, and what they called a totally failing foreign policy.
The energy crisis was absolutely front and center. And over again, the debate kept coming back to one specific place, the 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗏𝗦𝗖𝗥𝗓𝗡 coal power plant, and all the problems with how it was being run and supplied.
And this quote just perfectly captures the opposition's whole argument. MP 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗏𝗦𝗖𝗥𝗓𝗡 perera basically said, look, global events are one thing, but our energy crisis is a homemade problem. He pointed directly to what he called irregularities and administrative failures in buying coal as the root of the issue.
And he wasn't alone. Other members jumped in to reinforce this point. MPs 𝗙𝗢𝗪 Fernando and 𝗙𝗢𝗟𝗏𝗦𝗓𝗏 really drove home what this meant for regular people. They argued that buying bad-quality coal wasn't just a line item on a budget, it led to power cuts, serious environmental damage, and real health problems for people living anywhere near that plant.
From there, the conversation on the energy crisis just naturally flowed into a pretty sharp critique of the government's foreign policy. The opposition's claim was straightforward. The country's confusing and reactive approach on the world stage was making everyone vulnerable.
And they came with receipts. The leader of the opposition highlighted how strange it was to claim neutrality in the Middle East war, but then not condemn violations of the UN Charter. Then you had MP Rauf Hakim pointing to an 11-hour delay for an Iranian ship as proof that the policy was just muddled and indecisive. And this quote from MP Mujibur Rahman just summed up the opposition's complete frustration. He basically said, the fuel crisis wasn't some shocking, unpredictable event. It's common sense that a war in the Middle East affects oil prices. So his question was simple. Why did the government seem so totally unprepared?
But hey,
The pressure wasn't only happening in the main chamber with all the cameras rolling. A lot of the opposition's most detailed, nitty-gritty work took place away from the spotlight, in parliamentary committees. That's where they could really dig into the fine print of government policy.
Take the Infrastructure and Strategic Development Committee. They were looking at the whole fuel procurement process and that QR code system. And crucially, they talked about slapping penalties on suppliers who sent that bad coal and decided to ask the Attorney General for advice on how to make future contracts much tighter so this wouldn't happen again.
At the same time, you had the Environment Committee demanding a full report on the environmental mess caused by that same low-quality coal, and the Education Committee was busy with a totally different but just as important problem: all the issues people were reporting with the recruitment exam for new teachers.
So, after all that, what's the big picture? Well, that week in Parliament, from March 17th to the 20th, it really shows a multi-layered strategy from the opposition. They were combining these big public debates with quiet, methodical committee work to really turn up the heat on the government.
If you boil it all down, three things really stand out. First, the opposition successfully framed the energy crisis as a local management failure, not just a global issue. Second, they used every tool they had to scrutinize a whole range of policies, from crypto to foreign affairs. And third, the whole week was bookended by that fight over procedure, which just goes to show how deep the political tensions were running.
Look, this week was a masterclass in how to use parliamentary rules for oversight. But it does leave us with a pretty big question, right? As the country faces all these huge challenges, how does this kind of procedural pressure actually turn into the real, tangible solutions that people out there desperately need?